I didn't want to lead with that. So I got to be just kind of one of the guys with the team for a while. And if you only have them when you have to have them, time becomes a factor. And there's urgency put into what is already high stress. That's where, I think family businesses can become family burdens.
It is the successor. It is the next gen who's pushing and who's going to make that change.
Hey there, and welcome to Your Next Gen Friend, a successor's guide to business transition, a podcast for figuring out what's next in or beyond your family business. I'm Andrea Carpenter, transition strategist and second gen. Around here, we talk about the real stuff, family dynamics, identity, leadership, wealth, and how to define success on your own terms. Here's to finding your own way forward. I'm so glad you're here.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to Your Next Gen Friend. Today I'm super excited to be here with Josh. Actually super close to me. Argonaut is right in my backyard here in Denver, Colorado. So Josh is now the leader and owner of Argonaut Liquor in Denver. He didn't originally plan to join the family business, but shifting market forces brought him in. And then in the middle of one of the hardest years that his industry has seen, Josh actually stepped into leadership of the company. And since then, Josh has been doing some really cool things, significant operational and cultural changes, redefining how Argonaut communicates, operates, and adapts in a rapidly evolving industry. So I'm super excited to have Josh here to share some of his wisdom with us today. So welcome, Josh.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Maybe we could start with just a little bit of origin story. I know when we were talking before, you weren't even originally thinking about going into the business. So what changed around the time that you decided to start dipping your toes in?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, Argonaut's been in my family for, getting close to 70 years now. I'm actually fourth generation here, but like you said, that wasn't really the plan. Forever, our industry, it's a controlled substance, obviously liquor is. So it's highly dependent on the laws of each individual state. And there's always been a back and forth battle between the liquor store industry, which are small family-owned businesses, and mostly the grocery lobby, who, mega corporations, talking Kroger, talking, Amazon's gotten involved there now with Whole Foods, some of the biggest companies in the world. And they want to be able to sell more of what we sell and not have to have you have independent liquor stores, kind of like the way of a grocer, or not a grocer, sorry, a butcher or a flower shop. You don't see as many of those independents anymore because it's all moved into groceries. So that battle's been going on for years and years and years. In 2016, it sort of came to a head where the grocery stores said essentially to independent liquor stores, like, hey, if we don't negotiate something this year, we're going to go to the ballot and get everything from you right now, and we're going to take it. And that was kind of late 2015, with the ballot, or with the threat of the ballot initiatives into 2016. So my family and a bunch of the independent owners we knew negotiated what in Colorado was called, sort of jokingly now at the Capitol, but the Grand Compromise. And what that was essentially a phase in of more free market kind of economics over the next 20 years from 2016. And nobody was happy with it. Which is kind of generally what a good compromise is. But it gave liquor stores an off-ramp to sell their businesses, and it gave grocery stores an opportunity to start, or a route to market to start selling more of those wine and spirits products, beer, wine, and spirits products. Since then, the grocery stores have gone back either to the legislature or the ballot to change the pieces they didn't like. So it's been an ongoing fight. But how it relates to me was in 2016 was also right when I was graduating college, and we got this Grand Compromise passed. It looked like the industry was going to be more stable. There wasn't going to be this threat of your entire business is changing tomorrow because the voters decided. So I was talking with my dad, and I sort of wanted to be in the liquor industry. It's what I grew up in. I obviously enjoy the product a lot. So I had been talking to a couple of our suppliers. I got into the last round of interviewing with Boston Beer, which owns like Sam Adams and Truly and all that. And then I'd looked at like the Gallo recruiting program and doing some of that. So I always knew I wanted to be in the industry somewhere. But once the bill passed, was finally when my dad kind of came to me and said, maybe this makes sense for you. There's a path forward to at least, through the next 20 years. So, maybe this makes sense. And, the timing worked out well. And I started, a month or two after I graduated at the bottom doing all the fun stuff, learning the business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'd love to dive in a little more into exactly what that looked like. But I'm curious about particularly your mindset going in, because 2016 in terms of owning a business is actually not that far. That was not that long ago. 2016 in your journey. Was there anything in your mind at the time around ownership? Was it, and I think the answer is no on this one, you didn't feel obligated that you had to go into the business, but it was an industry that you liked. And so it maybe we just jump into like, as you started to like really start at the bottom and learning stuff, what was your mindset? What were the types of things you were thinking about? Was there any type of pinnacle or idea that you might eventually own the whole thing in your mind at the time?
Yeah, no. So I went into it I knew if I was going to do this, I wanted to make it a career, and I wanted some piece of ownership at some point. The liquor industry, particularly the retail side of it, doesn't pay very well. Compared to peers, I was much lower starting salary. I've lagged behind, and how you make up for that is ownership. So yes, I wanted to be an owner of the business. Now, the way our family had it set up, there had never been a sole owner of the business. It had sort of been split between my grandpa's side and my great uncle's side, and it had always been 50-50. And I'm sure we'll get into this later, but that was actually a big obstacle to overcome in the transition. Yeah, so I knew I wanted to be an owner. I knew I wanted to learn it from the bottom, do it right, make this a career, and it was really the opposite of obligation. It was really if you're going to do this, you got to come in and you got to prove it. If you want us to sell shares, if you want us to invest in you, this can't just be we're just handing you the keys situation. It's you got to show it and you got to earn it every day. And that was really my mindset going in was, this is what I'm doing for the rest of my life. And I want to be good at it. And I want the people around me that I'm working with, that hopefully eventually will be working for me to know me and respect me and understand my work ethic and what I bring to the table. And that's really what I thought going in, which as a, 22-year-old fresh out of college kid, wasn't always perfect. And, I certainly made mistakes along the way and, had good days and bad days, but that's what I tried to bring to the table.
Yeah. And you can learn a lot working alongside those people. So is there anything that you feel you learned working with the team and the staff and the way that you did that you wouldn't have learned any other way?
Totally. Not even a question. So, like I said, I started at the bottom. I started stocking shelves, driving deliveries. I didn't even really, for a while, tell people who I was, as it relates to the business. They sort of found out pretty quickly when my cousin who was running it spent a lot more time with me than anybody else on the floor. But, I didn't want to lead with that. So, I got to be just kind of one of the guys with the team for a while. And I did learn a lot that way. I learned a lot about how we had run the business, why we did some of the things the way we did. And a lot of it, as I got more and more into it, seemed very old school and very, very top-down communication, very, the information flow was controlled a certain way, the workflow was controlled a certain way. And, it had worked for us, obviously, for at that point 50 plus years, and made us a real leader in the Denver market. But it's where I started to see that, the way we were doing it might have been holding some of our employees back from really contributing, more to the business and really showing off their full potential. So that's where I really started to get a sense of that. And that was a really interesting starting point for me. And I for anyone going into a family business, I would totally recommend that. Start at the bottom, don't come in, even middle or at the top with all these ideas and wanting to change the world right away. And because you lose people that way. You lose the people who have been there forever, who are like, who is this kid all of a sudden telling me how to do my job? And there's a lot that I learned about our operations and how we did things that I would have on the surface thought, this makes no sense. This isn't, if I just came in and wanted to change a bunch of stuff, there are things I would have changed. And now looking back, I'm like, God, that would have been the worst thing I could have done. I mean, from people who had been there a long time, changing their processes to things I thought were more efficient. But if it's working for them, it's working for them, right? So I guess that was one of the benefits, was I really got to see what was working, what wasn't, and why. And then, apply that more to when the change from being an employee and one of the guys or whatever to a boss and a leader and an owner started to happen. I really got to understand why there were certain processes and why we did things certain ways, and then keep the ones that even on the surface I may not have thought were right, but were right, and change the ones that we did need to change.
Yeah. Really, I think that's a perfect kind of example of earning trust versus inheriting authority. And most people, especially when you're walking in with a last name and your family and all of those things, it can feel, I think, really easy for us to worry that our team is going to think that we're just inheriting that authority. So I love all the lessons learned and great advice for people coming in on how long it can really take to get to know the team and a company before you're actually making changes. That's a really hard thing too. So let's talk a little bit. You said that those were things, right, that you learned that you were able to eventually kind of bring in as you started to step into leadership more. Can you talk a little bit? Obviously, there were some big events, COVID 2022 in Denver with some big grocery wine ballot stuff. Can you talk a little bit about that inflection point and sort of you stepping into more of that leadership role?
Yeah. So, from 2016 till about, right before COVID in 2020, I was, like I said, started stocking shelves, driving deliveries, running it to cash register. And then I started to, I rotated around all of the different departments in the building. I worked in our office, taking orders, doing the cash count every day, things like that. Then I went and I ran our delivery department for a little bit, learning how that works, trying to bring some more technology to that piece of the business, which, I mean, thank God I did, because COVID hit, and I'll talk about that in a second. But and then I went and I helped run our front end for a while. So it was really a phase in of learning more and more and gaining more and more responsibility as I proved I was ready for it. So then COVID hits, and both my cousin who was running the business at the time and our general manager were both older and immunocompromised, and they came back pretty quickly, but they had to step away from the business for a little bit. We were an essential business, which, so we were open the whole time. We were dealing with the public the whole time. And that added a whole another layer of difficulty to, trying to, one, just my family dynamics at home, and the whole COVID experience. Like, my wife and I's COVID experience was wildly different. She's a nurse, so she was essential the whole time. Dealing with the public was wildly different than any of our friends. So it was a crazy time. But what it accelerated was my path into management and the amount of responsibility I had to take on, because those who were doing it at the time just couldn't be around. So I started, buying a little bit of product right around then. I helped us redo our entire delivery processes because, we went from, and Argonaut as a business, we do more of our more of our business e-com than almost any other liquor store in the country. I mean, most are 5% at max. During COVID, topped out around a third of our business being e-commerce. We went from doing, 50 to 75 deliveries a day, which at the time was a huge number, to around 300 a day overnight. And so a lot of the processes we had were totally antiquated. We could not handle that type of volume with the processes we had. So we had to, go back to the drawing board, and it was really me and my assistant general manager at the time and a few others. I remember one day, our office staff comes to us and goes, "Hey, we're getting all these phone calls, all these email orders, all these placed on our website. We can't." Our process at the time was to call the customer, set up a delivery time, all these things, and it took 3 or 4 touch points back and forth to the customer, and we had to completely just redesign our entire process in an afternoon. And again, it goes back to all that built trust. I couldn't have done that if I hadn't worked in that office first and understood what they dealt with, and how the increased volume was going to affect, not just their jobs, but their mental health and trying to coordinate all these things and keeping track of everything. It just wouldn't have worked. So, if I wouldn't have had that knowledge from, working it firsthand and also helping run the delivery department, having done that firsthand, there's no way I could have, in as short of a time as we needed in the business, redesigned all those processes and helped us, completely turn on a dime and be successful in a really tough period in the business.
Yeah, I think that's super cool, and also to keep the business alive, right? And your role in that. How do you think that played into sort of your relationship with the employees and the rest of the team, but also your relationship with the people who were the GM and the owner at the time? What do you think they saw in you because of that experience that you led the team through?
I think it was for most of the team, I think it was another really good example of showing my value to the business and being able to, really show people that I'm not just a name on the side of the building, that I really do bring something to the table. And, I've only been here a short amount of time. At that time, it was, about 3.5, almost 4 years. And I'm working with people who have worked for my family for 20, 30, almost 40 years plus at that time. And actually kind of fun when I was working our receiving, so checking in product, I was working with the manager there at the time, and we just got to chatting, and he's like, I was like, "Oh, how long have you been working here?" And he goes, "Oh, and he was really proud of it. And this is something I learned that I needed to, I made a mistake here. He was really proud of it. He's like, "I started in March of '93. And I was thinking about it for a second, and I was like, I was 2 months old. And I said that out loud, and I saw something flip, and I was like, oh, I don't think I should have said that. And he ended up actually leaving about a year later after that. And I think that conversation had something to do with it. So that was a good learning point of maybe don't point out exactly where you were when people started as you're working with them and about to, either overtake them in the org chart or whatever. But
it's just really interesting you said that, because I'm also a younger leader in my family and in my business, and I feel that tension sometimes even when talking to potential clients. They're like, "Wait, how old are you? You're like the same age as my kids. Why would we hire your firm?" But there's a lot you can lean on, right? With the legacy, that's one cool thing of being in a multi-generational business is, yeah, sure, I'm helping steward it to the future, but I am not the only person here. There's a lot of history and a lot of experience and a lot of really cool things
totally
that are here. Yeah, but it's easy.
And I got that a lot.
Yeah.
Right as this was transitioning, during the COVID time, because I was, 25. And I mean, you have to be 21 to work in the business. So it was very obvious I didn't have a ton of experience. So I got that a lot of, who is this kid or whatever? And some people who, I'm sure see it in other family businesses in the retail space where somebody comes in and they kind of flame out or don't end up running it. So it was totally an obstacle to, especially with our vendors, people putting in maybe some of the necessary time and effort because they already had relationships with, our GM, my cousin who was running the store. So why did they need to put time and effort into this guy who may not even end up being a decision maker for him? And I totally understand that, and I got it. But it was really, as we were saying, during the COVID time when I just was sort of thrust into a bunch of this new responsibility that I think people started realizing, one, this guy's good at this, and two, he's around for the long haul and isn't going to quit on us. And so for our vendors and for our employees, I think that was really important for them to see.
Yeah. And I know there was one more sort of big thing, that 2022 grocery wine ballot initiative. You're like kind of fully stepping into leadership. Did that coincide with that 2022? Was that kind of something that happened before? Maybe you can talk a little bit about 2022, what that did to your business, and kind of how, I know there was another period there of adapting and changing.
Yeah, definitely. So, from 2020 to 2022, it was, again, more just kind of phase in of, as someone didn't want a role or a responsibility anymore, I would pick it up and take that on. And that kind of continued up until 2022. And what happened in 22 was, like I mentioned earlier, the grocery stores didn't like a piece of the 2016 compromise. They wanted to sell wine in their stores right away, as opposed to I believe it would have been 2036 when they would have been able to do that anyway. So they ran a ballot initiative, and they outraised us 47 to 1. I think it was like 33 or 35 million to about 700 grand. And then they also brought in some kind of interesting partners in this. There was, because some of the delivery apps like GoPuff, DoorDash, Instacart wanted a third-party delivery bill at the same time, and then stores like Total Wine and More and one other local that wanted to become a chain wanted to run expanding licensing so you could make chains, essentially. So between all these companies and the grocery lobbies we talked about before, right? Kroger, Whole Foods, Amazon, all those. So between all of those organizations, they ran 3 ballot initiatives against us, who were saying no on all 3. And it was what we accomplished was incredible. I mean, we beat 2 of the 3 initiatives. Wine and grocery passed by less than 0.5%. It actually just missed the threshold for a mandatory recount. It was that close. I from our side, I took a leadership role in the No campaign. I worked on some of the political committees. I mean, that's where I sort of got my first big taste of that, was that piece of the business, which in a controlled industry is much more of your day-to-day life than I thought it was going to be going in. I say this all the time. One thing I did not expect going into the family business was that I was going to have to become a liquor lawyer or a lobbyist, and I have had to do a lot of that. So this was my first kind of dipping my toe into that, and it was a lot of new responsibility and stuff to take on. So when we lost wine and grocery, I mean, we saw our wine volume start to decrease overnight. I mean, I think it went into place March of 2023. And I mean, since then, our wine volumes declined about 60% from our peak. And, that caused a lot of, anytime you lose that much revenue, there are a lot of changes that need to happen in a business. And I I had a lot of ideas. I had a lot of, and some things that worked, some things that didn't. I had a lot of, I knew I knew I wanted to be here for the next 40 years of my life, hopefully. So I was really focused on how do we make this thing sustainable moving forward. So it was a lot of process improvements. It was, how do we staff at the appropriate level? So a lot of how do we find ways to make our operations more efficient, so we need less people, but we can take better care of the people we do have. And we've been very successful with that, which is awesome. And that's when I started to look at how we communicated in the business. Like I said at the beginning, it was a lot of top-down communication. Decisions were made by a key 2 or 3 or 4 people and then filtered down to the rest of the organization. And, I sort of said, I don't think that's serving us anymore. And my assistant general manager, who's now my director of ops, had an awesome idea of just, we didn't even have like a weekly management meeting. So we sat down with our, what we determined was the exec team. We had to kind of come up with what the definition of that was and sit down once a week. And even if we talk about nothing for 10 minutes, at least sit down for 10 minutes. And a lot of our big ideas and how we change some of these processes have come from just having that one meeting. And then another thing I did that was very different in the business was I read a book on my honeymoon called Unreasonable Hospitality. It's by Will Guidara. Fantastic. And I was obsessed with it. I mean, I read it once, I listened to it again, and then I had our exec team as part of our meetings, these weekly meetings, read a chapter. My cousin at the time sort of jokingly called it book club. And we'd, read a chapter. And if you're not familiar with the book, it's about 11 Madison Park and how they became the best restaurant in the world, not because of the food, right? You don't get that without the food, but really how the customer service and the hospitality of what they did made them the best restaurant in the world.
And again, I love it. Even if you're not, obviously, Josh is in a service kind of retail business, but even if you're not in retail, our business is services and consulting, and it's still the themes in there are so relevant to anyone who has customers, which is most businesses. So yeah, it's a great book recommendation. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, I recommend it to anyone who owns a small business or any size business or anybody who deals with customers, because just the way they thought about hospitality and how you make people feel when they're spending money with you. I thought, some of it's like, yeah, duh, I know that. Like you're supposed to take good care of people, but how that can then take care of your business and really the part that I thought was the most interesting was how taking care of your team and your employees will then take care of your business. And that's really, as we were doing book club, as they called it, that's really what I wanted to bring in. I wanted to kind of empower our team to do more and come up with more and make processes that would help them, do their jobs more efficiently or find more satisfaction in those jobs and see what that did for the business. And part of it is taking care of people isn't just pay, right? I mean, there's a lot of ways you can improve people's job satisfaction and the take home people get out of their work without paying them more, which we weren't in a position to do. And I thought that was one of the most valuable pieces of the book. So we slowly started changing how we worked with our employees and how we worked with our coworkers to make everything more, okay, you don't like this piece of your job or you think this is inefficient. How do we help you, work that out, and how do we make a better process and whatever? And what started happening was, we'd all get together, talk about issues, whatever. And this is from another book I read, but we all started rowing in the same direction, right? Instead of us all having our little narrow windows of the business that we looked through and trying to, take things in that direction, everybody saw, more of the vision and more of what we were doing as an organization and pushed in that direction. And how do I make my little window of this more streamlined into the total operation? And that was one of the biggest changes, was getting, specifically the exec team, but even further down than that, more involved in the business and more bought in to where, they wanted to make their lives better and easier and whatever. And, we could eliminate processes, eliminate steps, make things more efficient with that feedback, because I'm not doing it every day. My cousin wasn't doing it every day. Our GM wasn't doing it every day. So, we needed that feedback from people, and people to be bought in enough to say, here's how we can do this better. Here's how we can make this more efficient. Mm-hmm. And that was a huge shift from how we had, communicated and done business previously.
Yeah. So as someone kind of in a similar seat right now, so I'm working really closely with the current owner of our company and kind of redesigning our process. We redid our service delivery model. I've been starting to come in and I'm having new ideas, which is super great when you're in a position to be able to do that, right? Like, I find it very valuable work. And it sounds like you also were going through this phase where you were learning a lot as a leader. You were growing. You felt like you were able to make a big impact on the company. And then you start to feel a little bit of the tension potentially, because you're like, well, I'm doing all of this and I'm ready to become an owner. I'm ready for more responsibility. You might have at that time still been making decisions, but it wasn't really your final decision. You maybe still had to get sign off from someone else on other pieces. And I know today we're not going to go super deep into exactly the specifics of your transition, but maybe you can talk a little bit about, as you started to take over more of that leadership role, you went through this transitionary period where you started to also talk about ownership of the company itself. Can you just on a high level talk about some of the things that came up in that transition that were maybe difficult or things that you didn't expect?
Yeah, totally. Well, I mean, first thing, and, obviously why things like this exist is transitioning family businesses is hard. And I think at the beginning, we did a really good job. Some of the things we've talked about, we had me start at the bottom and work my way up and earn the trust and respect of, the people I was going to be managing and working with. And for a long time, we did a really, really good job. And then the hard part happened. And okay, this person's, meaning me, this person's here. He's good at this. He meets, he's made it a career. How do we make sure he's getting taken care of appropriately? And we didn't have a great answer for that question. And in how I brought that question to the table, I made a lot of mistakes, a lot. And, I think the conversation was framed in a way where, it's always been 50-50 between this side and this side. So it needs to stay that way. And I didn't do a good job of trying to break that frame earlier on and saying, look, I know we've done it this way for forever, but, the business has changed. We've changed. How do we make this fair and equitable to, so I dedicate my life to this because, like I said, the retail industry, the liquor retail industry specifically, does not pay very well. So if, from a W-2 salary perspective, the only way to make up that gap between me and my peers was through equity. And, so I think we made some mistakes there, but really, the challenges were just some of the old mindsets of how the business was supposed to be run. And we were hitting a period of major transitions in the business. Like I said, losing a giant piece of our revenue and trying to figure out, can this business support 5 families anymore? Can it not? What's the right thing for the person who's going to be running it, and doesn't have the opportunity to go out and do other things with their time to support themselves and their family. And I think a lot of the breakdowns in communication were around that. And yeah, again, without getting into it too specifically, I think, one of the biggest things you can do is have those conversations early and have a transition plan figured out early. And work in there somewhere that if there are major changes to the fundamental, assumptions that were created when you were creating this plan, that we need to reevaluate and renegotiate and it because I think where we ran into problems was we did have to go back and renegotiate how this was going to look for the whole family, and we were under the gun because if we didn't do something, there was a chance the business wasn't going to be there for anybody to operate, and I think that caused a lot of hurt, and it's something I still regret and don't feel good about how it went. But there was a sense of urgency that, I mean, sure, if we had a crystal ball, we could have avoided. But if we had started having some of these conversations earlier, we probably could have avoided and come to, a more equitable solution for everyone. And so, yeah, if there was, one piece of advice, I guess it's do as much planning and as much contingency planning and as much, have these difficult conversations early, because if you only have them when you have to have them, time becomes a factor. And when time becomes a factor and there's urgency put into what is already high stress, family dynamics get involved. People's personal histories get involved. If you add time and urgency to that, that's where I think family businesses can become family burdens, and that's really hard.
And especially you being fourth gen, right? When you get to third gen, fourth gen, just the number of people that can be there at that time. I did an interview last year with, his name is Mitch Gambert. Similar situation. It ended up all consolidating back into one area. And sometimes that is the right path. I'm not saying if you're a third or fourth generation business that is 100% what's going to happen. But Josh, I love some of the things that you said around if we can talk about things earlier, understand what's important. Fairness and equality is interesting because what's fair is not always equal. And that can be hard if you feel or perceive, or literally sometimes you're like, yeah, the numbers show that's not equal, but what are the reasons we're doing those things? And you named some of the things very clearly that we often see the person who's running the company, who's going to steward it into the future, who's going to continue to invest time and figure out what all of those things look like. You have to take all of those things into consideration. And the last thing I was just going to say, you said you got to have a transition plan. I think that's why we always call them roadmaps, because roadmaps can change and obstacles can come up and the market can shift really quickly. And if you have a roadmap, there might be some contingencies that you're already able to build in. And so time can be a friend here. And if you're a successor listening, it's kind of like, how do you start to bring this up? And I don't know if you, obviously your situation, you ended up getting a little bit under the wire, but if you have any advice for the listeners on if they're interested in ownership or maybe still even just considering it, but seeing that could be in their future, I would argue 5, 7, 10 years, even if it's that close, it could be a great time to start those conversations now. So what advice would you give to someone thinking about this?
Yeah, it's tough because, every organization is different, right? I mean, ours is a family business where it was 100% owned by family, and we could kind of have a little bit more control and dictate some of the terms of how a transition was going to go. That's not always the case, right? But but as much as you can, especially with the current leaders of the organization, I would try to go in and say, and be very honest and open and say, look, I am making a career out of this. I want to run this thing for the next, whatever it is, 20, 30, 40 years. I want to make this my life. So, if we do that if I do that, and if we decide that I am the person that's got the skills and abilities to be able to do this, and if and if all these conditions are met, what does this look like for me financially and from a ownership and leadership perspective? And, and it actually is a lot more than just financially. I mean, it really is who has the final say on this, who gets to, make X type of decision, who gets to make Y type of decision. And how does that change over time? And it's, like I said, I think the biggest, most important thing you can do is just plan and have these hard conversations, and they are really hard. And I hated having them. And I think that avoidance led to, again, some of the problems that caused a lot of heartache down the road. And I acknowledge my role in that. And but it really, have these conversations early, get uncomfortable, say, all right, if I had a conversation with my dad early on, and I said, look, what happens if I'm not right for this? And he kind of goes, well, I don't think I'd ever fire you, but I'd probably give you a month warning where you need to go find something else. Right. I mean, that's something you need to talk out. What does that look like? If I'm not doing the job as I'm supposed to, or I'm not growing as I'm supposed to, or I'm not bringing the value to the business I'm supposed to, what happens? Right. And it's all these little things that, at the beginning seem very small and very unlikely, or way down the road, that as you get closer and closer to a transition, and certainly if something like market forces accelerate that, you really need to have all of that buttoned down. Or at least have an effective mode of how can we talk about this? And I think that, looking back, was the biggest thing we were missing. We didn't have enough of those hard conversations, and I didn't have enough of those hard conversations to, make sure we had planned for what could happen well enough.
Yeah. And I think it just shows like growth as a leader and a family member, that you can recognize that now and start to do things to repair that. But also a big part of what you're doing is taking the business into the future to end us on kind of a note. Maybe we just, I'd love to know what excites you about the future of your business and where you're going. And maybe share a little bit of that as we get close to wrapping up.
Yeah, absolutely. God, there's a lot to be excited about for me moving forward. I really think the medium to long term outlook for the business is good. In the short term, like the last 2 years of business for us have been absolutely brutal. The industry is having problems. Our main road, Colfax here in Denver, has been under construction basically since I bought the business. I think the construction started 3 months after. So, for any retail business, access problems are massive. And there are demographic changes and things in the industry that have not gone our way. But with, hopefully the road getting finished up in they're telling us the next month or two. I don't know if that's a real timeline or not, but hopefully, and all the growth and investment in our neighborhood that is happening, from the city and from private investors, there is a lot of opportunity. And I am really excited to be able to have, changed our organization in a way we were able to, like any business does in a hard time, get really skinny, cut your costs as much as you can, try and raise margins where you can, and then take those lessons when market forces do turn around. And hopefully there's an opportunity to really turn the business around and to not just, keep surviving as we have for the last couple of years, but really thrive. And hopefully, as the owner now, I get rewarded for all the hard work and lost sleep and stress and therapy bills that are starting to add up, that that all this has caused. And so that's what I'm looking forward to, is hopefully at some point starting to see the fruits of all the labor, we put in this transitionary period for the business, and see that start to turn around.
Yeah, I love that. Awesome. And then as a closing question, I'm playing with this question. If a next gen is listening to this, but you were actually sitting in the room and able to talk with them, what's one thing that you'd tell them to try this week?
Oh man. I think I keep going back to, and we've talked about this a lot, but I keep going back to plan. Get uncomfortable. Talk with the people above you in the organization, whether they're family or not, about what does this look like for me if I am going to be this person for you all, and I am going to make this my life. Coming out of this conversation and looking back now, that's the biggest thing, is just get uncomfortable, have the really hard conversations, which easier said than done, Josh. Great. Right. Yeah. But, it will pay off in the end. And you may not even know it will pay off because you will have a smooth transition, but I can guarantee you, if you don't, there's a lot of heartache that comes with it.
Yeah. I love that advice. And I guess my shameless plug is, if you need help thinking about how to position that conversation, please just email me or message me on Instagram. I'm happy to be a thought partner, because sometimes it helps to role play or drop a couple bullet points of things that you're thinking about saying before going into a conversation. But I think just starting a conversation is an amazing advice, because nothing is going to move forward. And oftentimes it is the successor, it is the next gen who's pushing and who's going to make that change. So. Yep.
And, shameless plug for me, the whiskey helps. So if you guys need to have those conversations, we got plenty.
Awesome. I love that. Yeah. So if you're in Denver, Capitol Hill neighborhood, Argonauts at, Washington and Colfax?
Colfax and Washington, exactly.
Yep. Washington. So stop in, say hi to Josh. I appreciate you coming on the podcast and sharing your story with us today.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. This has been great.
Awesome. We'll see you next time.
That's it for today. I hope today's episode offered some clarity, or at least a little company. If this resonated, I'd be so grateful if you'd share it with another next gen. While my podcast is for the successors, you can also check out its sister show, The Business Transition Roadmap, hosted by my business partner, Elizabeth Ledoux. There's lots of great material in business and family succession over there. I hope you'll take a listen. Be well, and see you next time.